The Herodian Gambit, A Tale of a Queen and a Prophet, Chapter 1. A dangerous ambition in the year 27 AD. In the lavish palace of Machaerus rising above the barren hills near the Dead Sea, a girl on the cusp of womanhood practiced her dancing. Her dark hair swung across her back as she twirled and leapt, her body moving sinuously to the beat of drums and the trilling of pipes. Beads of sweat glistened on her brow in the shimmering desert heat. This was Salome, the beautiful daughter of Herodias. Though just 14 years old, Salome already carried herself with a regal bearing and flashed knowing looks from kohl-lined eyes. Like her mother, she was cunning, ambitious, already well-versed in the machinations of palace life under the rule of Herod Antipas, Tetrarch of Galilee and Perea. Salome's father was Herod II, brother of Antipas, but that mattered little now. In a bold and unprecedented act that sent shockwaves through the royal family, Herodias had divorced Herod II and married his more powerful brother. It was a brazen move befitting a queen, a status Herodias was determined to secure for herself and her daughter at any cost. As Salome danced in the courtyard under the watchful eye of her mother, Herodias looked on with an approving nod and a gleam of calculation in her eyes. The girl's graceful movements and alluring beauty would be a potent weapon, Herodias knew, in the high-stakes game of power and influence at Herod's court. In Salome, Herodias saw shades of her own shrewd intellect and fierce will, traits that ran strong in the women of her Hasmonean bloodline. Herodias herself, now in her mid-30s, remained a striking figure, her sharp beauty that of a lioness in its prime. She adorned herself in resplendent robes and glittering jewels, costly luxuries financed by Antipas' wealth. With a king as a grandfather and as a former wife of a tetrarch, Herodias was accustomed to the trappings of royalty. But mere trappings were no longer enough. She craved true power. And in the weak-willed Antipas, enthralled by her seductive charms, Herodias saw her chance to at last rule in more than just name. The tides of history now surged around this desert citadel, currents soon to be upended by a woman's fateful ambition. None could foresee the turmoil and bloodshed that would soon emanate from this remote palace, set into motion by a spellbinding dance and a king's rash oath. Herodias' unflinching quest for power was about to collide with the moral righteousness of a prophet in the wilderness, a man called John the Baptist. From her balcony, Herodias looked out over the arid landscape, her gaze trailing to the haze-shrouded peaks of Nebo in the distance. The same land once traversed by Moses, who centuries ago had led the Israelites to the threshold of their destiny. Now, destiny stirred again in this ancient place. This time, a woman would shape its course, daring to cross lines and defy tradition in her relentless rise. On the brink of a new era, Herodias stood ready to stake her claim and to accept the price it would exact. Chapter 2. The voice in the wilderness. In the stark wilderness near the Jordan River, a voice cried out, the impassioned words carrying across the barren landscape. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. The voice belonged to John, a prophet who had emerged from the desert clad in camel's hair, his appearance as wild as his message. Day after day, John preached of the coming Messiah, baptizing the penitent in the river's flowing waters as he called all to prepare the way of the Lord. John's renown had spread throughout the region, his words a crackling fire that drew throngs of people hungry for redemption and purpose. Even the great and powerful took note, wondering at this zealous ascetic who commanded the attention of commoner and nobleman alike. Among those who kept a wary eye on the Baptist was Herod Antipas himself. The Tetrarch had forged a tenuous peace in his realms, but he knew well how quickly the winds of public sentiment could shift. In the back of his mind lurked the grim memory of his father, Herod the Great, whose ruthless ambition had left a legacy of bloodshed. Antipas had no desire to follow that path, but neither could he allow a potential threat to his rule to go unchecked. For now, Antipas was content to observe, to gather information about this wild-eyed prophet through a network of spies and informants. Let the people have their spectacle in the desert, he reasoned, so long as it kept them placated. In the marbled halls of his palace, he had more pressing matters to attend to. Chief among those matters was his new wife, Herodias. Their marriage had sent ripples of scandal throughout the land, But Antipas was too enthralled to care. In Herodias he found a kindred spirit, a woman as shrewd and ambitious as himself. Together they schemed and plotted, always angling to solidify their grip on power. But even as Antipas reveled in his newfound alliance, he could not shake a sense of unease. There was a hardness in Herodias, ruthless gleam in her eye that both captivated and unsettled him. He had won her hand, but he was not entirely sure he could control her. Such thoughts swirled in Antipas' mind as he reclined on a couch, sipping wine and watching Salome dance for the assembled court. The girl moved with bewitching grace, her lithe form swaying to the music as the nobility looked on with avid eyes. Antipas felt a twinge of pride and something else, an uncomfortable stirring he immediately pushed away. Salome was his by marriage, but she belonged to Herodias in every way that mattered. As the dancing concluded and the court erupted in applause, Antipas caught Herodias' eye across the room. In that moment, a look passed between them, a look of shared triumph and secret understanding. They had risen high, the two of them, but there was farther yet to climb. And woe to anyone who dared stand in their way. Far away in the wilderness, John the Baptist continued to cry out, his voice a clarion call to a kingdom not of this earth. The threads of history were weaving together, a prophet's words and a queen's ambition on a collision course that would shake the foundations of an empire. Chapter 3: The Gathering Storm in the Grand Hall of Machaerus. A feast was underway, a sumptuous display of Herod Antipas' wealth and power. Nobles and dignitaries reclined on plush couches, their faces flushed with wine and merriment. Servants wove deftly through the crowd, bearing trays of delicacies from across the empire. Roasted peacock, dormice dipped in honey, figs stuffed with spiced nuts. At the center of it all sat Antipas and Herodias, resplendent in richly dyed robes and glittering with jewels. They surveyed the gathered throng with an air of regal benevolence, graciously accepting the accolades and flattery heaped upon them. But beneath the veneer of celebration, an undercurrent of tension crackled in the air. In the days leading up to the feast, John the Baptist's condemnation of Herod and Herodias' marriage had grown more strident, his fiery denunciations carrying even into the palace walls. For Herodias, the prophet's words were an intolerable affront, a challenge to her legitimacy that could not go unanswered. Antipas, ever the pragmatist, sought to quell his wife's fury. He dispatched emissaries to John, seeking to broker a truce, to persuade the prophet to temper his rhetoric for the sake of stability. But John would not be moved. "It is not lawful for you to have her," he declared, his eyes blazing with righteous conviction. The rebuff only stoked the flames of Herodias' anger. She seethed at this desert preacher's audacity, his presumption in dictating the morality of kings. Who was he, this wild man draped in rags, to speak of sin and repentance to the descendants of Herod the Great? As the feast wore on and the wine flowed freely, Herodias leaned close to Antipas, her voice a seductive whisper in his ear. She spoke of the insult to their honor, the necessity of a strong response. She goaded and cajoled, playing on Antipas' pride and his desire to please her. Antipas wavered, torn between his fear of provoking unrest and his inability to deny Herodias. In the end, as it always did, his wife's will prevailed. With a heavy heart, he gave the order. John the Baptist was to be arrested and imprisoned in the dungeons of Machaerus. The deed was done swiftly, quietly, so as not to disrupt the revels. In the depths of the palace, in a dank cell hewn from the rock, John sat in chains, his face turned toward the tiny window that let in a sliver of light. Even here, in the bowels of his enemy's stronghold, his spirit remained unbroken. He prayed fervently, his faith a beacon in the darkness. In the hall above, Herodias savored her triumph, her eyes glinting with malicious satisfaction. She had silenced her critic, asserted her power for all to see. But even as she basked in the glow of victory, a flicker of unease stirred in her heart. In the depths of her being, she sensed that this was only the beginning, that the conflict between her and the prophet was far from over. The wheels of fate were turning, propelled by pride, ambition, and the inexorable weight of history. In a dance of power and retribution, queen and prophet hurtled, toward a reckoning that would echo through the ages. Chapter 4 Whispers in the Palace. In the weeks following John's imprisonment, an uneasy quiet settled over Machaerus. The palace hummed with its usual intrigues and entertainments, but beneath the surface, a palpable tension simmered. Herodias was not content with merely silencing John. She wanted him destroyed, his influence extinguished once and for all. She pressured Antipas to execute the prophet, arguing that his continued existence posed a threat to their rule. But Antipas, for all his moral weakness, harbored a deep fascination with the Baptist. He recognized in John a spiritual authority that both attracted and repelled him, and he could not bring himself to snuff out that light. And so John languished in his cell, his days marked by prayer and prophetic visions. His followers, bereft of their leader, struggled to maintain the momentum of his movement. Some drifted away, their faith wavering in the face of adversity. Others clung to John's teachings all the more fiercely, their resolve hardened by persecution. Whispers of John's fate spread throughout the land, mingling with the ever-present rumors of political unrest and messianic fervor. In the marketplaces and temple courtyards, people spoke of the prophet in hushed tones, wondering at the meaning of his imprisonment. Some saw it as a sign of the tetrarch's depravity, others as a challenge to the very foundations of the social order. Herodias paid little heed to the murmurings of the masses. Her focus was fixed on the consolidation of her own power, on securing her place in the imperial web that stretched from Rome to the far reaches of Judea. She cultivated alliances with influential figures, dispensing favors and flattery with calculated charm. Among those who fell under Herodias' sway was Salome, her daughter who was blossoming into a woman of striking beauty and cunning. Salome absorbed her mother's lessons in statecraft and manipulation, her quick mind and ruthless ambition marking her as a force to be reckoned with. As the months passed and the tides of discontent rose higher, Antipas grew increasingly uneasy. He was caught between the demands of his wife, the expectations of his Roman overlords, and the restless stirrings of his own conscience. In moments of quiet, he would descend to the dungeons to visit John, engaging the prophet in lengthy discussions of faith and morality. John met Antipas' inquiries with unwavering conviction, his words a searing indictment of the corruption and sin that festered at the heart of the tetrarch's court. He spoke of a coming judgment, of a kingdom that would outlast all earthly powers. Antipas listened, alternately fascinated and unsettled, his soul a battleground between the pull of the eternal and the lure of temporal glory. All the while, in the shadows of the palace, Herodias watched and waited, her patience as cold and implacable as the desert night. She sensed the shifting currents of power, the precarious balance that held her world together. And she knew, with a certainty born of ruthless ambition, that the time for decisive action was drawing near. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the limits of faith, the depths of human cruelty, and the inexorable march of history. In the crucible of Machaerus, the fates of a prophet, a queen, and a king would collide, and the world would tremble at the impact. Chapter 5 A reckless oath. The day of Herod Antipas' birthday dawned hot and unnaturally still over Machaerus, as if the very air held its breath in anticipation. Throughout the palace, servants scurried to and fro, preparing for the grand celebration that would mark the occasion. In the kitchens, great fires roared as cooks labored over simmering pots and roasting meats, the savory aromas mingling with the ever-present tang of desert dust. Herodias oversaw the preparations with a critical eye, her exacting standards driving the household to a frenzy of activity. No detail was too small to escape her notice, from the drape of the banquet hall curtains to the polish on the silver goblets. This feast was more than a mere birthday observance. It was a display of power, a statement of her and Antipas' unassailable position at the pinnacle of Judean society. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, guests began to arrive, a glittering throng of nobles, officials, and military commanders. They filed into the palace courtyards, their finery a dazzling array of richly dyed robes, glinting armor, and jeweled adornments. The air hummed with the murmur of conversation, punctuated by the clink of wine cups and the strains of music from strategically placed ensembles. Antipas, resplendent in a purple-trimmed toga, played the part of gracious host, his booming laugh and expansive gestures masking the unease that gnawed at his gut. He could feel the weight of Herodias' expectations, the unspoken demand that he project an image of unassailable strength and authority. And yet, even in the midst of the revelry, his thoughts kept straying to the dungeons below, to the gaunt figure of John the Baptist, whose piercing gaze seemed to strip away all pretense. As the day wore on and the wine flowed ever more freely, the atmosphere in the palace took on a fevered, almost frenzied quality. Laughter grew louder, conversations more raucous, and the line between propriety and excess began to blur. Herodias moved through the crowds like a shark through the shoals, her smile razor-sharp, her eyes glinting with a predatory intensity. And then came the moment that would be forever seared into the annals of history. Salome, Herodias' daughter, took to the center of the banquet hall, her lithe form draped in gossamer silks. She began to dance, her movements fluid and hypnotic, her body undulating to the pulsing rhythms of the music. The assembled guests watched, transfixed, as the young woman spun and swayed, her performance a mesmerizing blend of sensuality and danger. Antipas, flushed with wine and enthralled by Salome's dancing, leaned forward on his couch, his eyes glassy with desire. In a moment of reckless abandon, he called out to the girl, his voice slurring with drink and emotion. "Ask me for whatever you wish," he proclaimed, "and I will give it to you, up to half my kingdom." The words hung in the air, heavy with portent, as Salome stopped her dance and turned to face the tetrarch. A smile played at the corners of her mouth, a smile that held the promise of secrets and the threat of ruin. She glanced to Herodias, a silent question passing between mother and daughter. And in that moment, the trap snapped shut. Chapter 6: A prophet's fate. In the hushed stillness that followed Antipas' pronouncement, Salome slipped from the banquet hall, her footsteps echoing on the marble floors. She made her way to her mother's chambers, her heart pounding with a heady mix of excitement and trepidation. Herodias was waiting, her face a mask of composed anticipation. She had watched the scene unfold with a sense of triumph, recognizing the opportunity that had landed squarely in her lap. In Antipas' rash offer, she saw the means to rid herself of John the Baptist once and for all, to silence the voice that had haunted her dreams and threatened her ambitions. Mother and daughter conferred in urgent whispers, their heads bent close together in the flickering lamplight. Herodias' words were precise, her instructions clear and unwavering. Salome listened, her eyes widening as she grasped the full import of what was being asked of her. For a moment, a flicker of doubt crossed her face, a hint of hesitation in the face of such a grim request. But Herodias was relentless, her will as unyielding as the desert bedrock. She reminded Salome of the power that was within their grasp, of the need to eliminate any threat to their position. She spoke of loyalty and obedience, of the rewards that would come to those who were bold enough to seize their destiny. In the end, Salome acquiesced, her misgivings subsumed by the force of her mother's conviction. With a nod of resolution, she turned and made her way back to the banquet hall, her bearing regal, her purpose unwavering. The assembled guests fell silent as Salome re-entered, their eyes tracking her every move. She approached Antipas' couch, her gaze locking with his in a moment of charged intensity. The tetrarch leaned forward, his expression expectant, his breath quickening with anticipation. Salome's voice was clear and steady as she spoke, each word falling like a stone into the waiting hush. "I ask," she declared, "for the head of John the Baptist on a platter." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, a shockwave of disbelief and horror. Antipas recoiled as if struck, his face draining of color. For a long moment, he sat frozen, his mind reeling with the implications of Salome's request. He had made a vow, a public declaration that could not be easily revoked. To refuse would be to admit weakness, to undermine his own authority in the eyes of his subjects. And yet, the thought of acceding to such a ghastly demand filled him with revulsion. He had kept John alive for so long, held captive by a mix of fascination and fear. To end the prophet's life in such a brutal fashion seemed a step too far, a plunge into an abyss from which there could be no return. In the end, it was Herodias who tipped the scales, her gaze boring into Antipas with an intensity that brooked no refusal. In that look, the Tetrarch saw the iron resolve that had brought them to this moment, the ruthless determination that had propelled their rise to power. He saw, too, the unspoken threat that lurked beneath the surface, the knowledge that to defy Herodias was to court ruin. With a heavy heart and a sickness in his soul, Antipas gave the nod. The order was given, the deed set in motion. In the bowels of Machaerus, the executioner's blade was sharpened, and a prophet prepared to meet his fate. Chapter 7 Echoes of silence in the dank, suffocating darkness of his cell. John the Baptist knelt in prayer, his spirit unbowed by the weight of his chains. He had long known that his path would lead to this moment, that his uncompromising message of repentance and righteousness would inevitably bring him into conflict with the powers of this world. And yet, even as he faced the looming specter of death, John's faith burned bright, a fierce and unquenchable flame. He prayed for strength, for the courage to meet his end with dignity and unwavering conviction. He prayed for his followers, for the fledgling movement that had sprung up around his teaching, that they might find the fortitude to carry on in his absence. Above all, he prayed for the souls of his captors, for Herod Antipas and Herodias, mired in a web of sin and corruption. In his heart, John knew that their actions were driven by fear, by a desperate bid to cling to their earthly power and privilege. He pitied them, even as he condemned their choices, recognizing the emptiness that lay at the core of their existence. As he prayed, John's mind drifted to the teachings of the prophets who had come before him, to the whispered promises of a Messiah who would usher in a new age of justice and redemption. He had long believed that he was a herald of this coming kingdom, a voice crying out in the wilderness to prepare the way of the Lord. Now, facing the imminent prospect of his own demise, John wondered if his role in the unfolding drama was nearing its end. Had he fulfilled his purpose, paved the way for the one who was to come? Or was there some further test, some final trial that he must endure? Lost in contemplation, John barely registered the sound of footsteps echoing in the corridor outside his cell. It was only when the heavy wooden door swung open, revealing the grim visage of the executioner, that the prophet was jolted back to the present. There was no need for words. The intent was clear in the hooded figure's stance, in the glint of the blade that hung at his side. John rose to his feet, his motion slow and deliberate, his gaze steady and unflinching. As the executioner stepped forward, John bowed his head in a final act of submission, his lips moving in a silent prayer. He thought of the wilderness that had been his home, of the mighty Jordan where he had baptized countless souls. He thought of the multitudes who had flocked to hear his message, the hunger in their eyes, the yearning for something more than the fleeting pleasures of this world. And then, in a moment of blinding clarity, John saw beyond the veil of flesh and blood, glimpsed the eternal realm that awaited him. A sense of peace settled over him, a profound and unshakable conviction that his death was not the end, but rather a beginning, a doorway to a truth that surpassed all human understanding. The blade flashed, a swift and brutal arc, and John the Baptist, the prophet who had set the stage for a revolution that would reshape the very fabric of history, passed from this world to the next, a martyr to the cause of righteousness and truth. In the halls of Machaerus, a stunned silence reigned, the weight of the deed hanging heavy in the air. And in the chambers of Herodias, a queen smiled, her triumph tinged with a shadow of unease, a premonition of the reckoning that was to come. Chapter 8 Whispers of Discontent. The news of John the Baptist's execution spread like wildfire through the palace, a seismic shock that reverberated from the lowliest servant to the highest echelons of power. In the aftermath of the deed, a pall seemed to settle over Machaerus, a sense of unease and foreboding that even the most jaded courtiers could not escape. For Herod Antipas, the weight of his actions bore down like a crushing burden. In the sober light of day, stripped of the wine-soaked haze of the banquet, he was forced to confront the enormity of what he had done. He had killed a man, a holy man, on the whim of a dancing girl and the machinations of his wife. The knowledge gnawed at him, a festering wound that would not heal. Antipas sought solace in the distractions of governance, throwing himself into the daily business of ruling his tetrarchy. He held court, dispensed justice, and conferred with his advisors, all the while trying to ignore the whispers that dogged his every step. Whispers of weakness, of moral decay, of a ruler in thrall to the whims of a woman. Herodias, for her part, reveled in her victory, her satisfaction tempered only by the realization that her work was not yet done. John's death had removed an immediate threat, but she knew that the seeds of discontent he had sown would continue to take root. She redoubled her efforts to consolidate her power, to fortify her position against any challenge that might arise. But even as she schemed and plotted, Herodias could not shake a growing sense of unease, a feeling that her triumph was built on shifting sands. In quiet moments, she found herself haunted by the memory of John's piercing gaze, the unwavering conviction in his eyes as he faced his death. She had destroyed the man, but she could not silence the echoes of his words, the nagging doubts that crept unbidden into her mind. As the days turned into weeks, the people of Judea grappled with the aftermath of John's death. For some, the prophet's martyrdom only served to cement his status as a herald of the coming Messiah, a voice of truth silenced by the corrupt powers of the world. Others, more pragmatic, saw in John's fate a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of speaking truth to power. In the halls of Rome, the news of the Baptist's execution was greeted with a mix of indifference and mild curiosity. The intrigues of a distant desert province were of little concern to the imperial court, consumed as it was with its own webs of politics and power. And yet, even in the heart of the empire, there were those who sensed the significance of the moment, who recognized in John's death the stirrings of a force that would one day reshape the very foundations of the world. As the shock of the prophet's demise began to fade, life in Machaerus settled into an uneasy rhythm. Herod and Herodias, bound together by shared secrets and shared guilt, presented a united front to the world, their public faces a mask of confidence and control. But in the shadows of the palace, the cracks were beginning to show, the rot at the core of their unholy alliance slowly spreading. And all the while, in the streets and synagogues, in the fields and villages, the seeds that John had planted continued to grow, his message of repentance and renewal taking root in the hearts of the people. The Baptist was dead, but his legacy lived on, a flame that would not be extinguished, a light that would continue to shine in the darkness. Chapter 9: The Unraveling. As the months passed and the specter of John's death began to recede, Herod Antipas and Herodias found themselves facing a new and unsettling reality. The unease that had gripped the tetrarchy in the wake of the prophet's execution had given way to something more insidious, a slow but steady erosion of the royal couple's authority and legitimacy. Whispers of discontent, once confined to the shadowed corners of the palace, now spilled out into the open, spreading like a contagion through the towns and villages of Galilee and Perea. The people, long burdened by the weight of Herod's rule, began to give voice to their grievances, emboldened by the memory of John's defiance. For Herodias, the mounting unrest was a bitter pill to swallow. She had fought tooth and nail to secure her place at the pinnacle of power, had sacrificed everything to achieve her ambitions. The thought that it might all slip away, that she could be brought low by the grumblings of the unwashed masses, filled her with a cold and implacable fury. In a desperate bid to shore up their crumbling support, Herod and Herodias embarked on a campaign of bread and circuses, lavishing the people with spectacles and public works. They hosted elaborate festivals, commissioned grand building projects, and dispensed largesse with a heavy hand, all in the hope of buying the loyalty of their subjects. But even as they worked to dazzle the crowds, the royal couple could not escape the growing shadow of Rome. The empire, once content to let its client kings rule with a relatively free hand, had begun to take a keener interest in the affairs of Judea. Reports of Herod's misrule, of the unrest bubbling just beneath the surface, had reached the ears of the Emperor Tiberius, and the imperial gaze had turned, cold and appraising, toward the troubled tetrarchy. For Herod, the prospect of Roman intervention was a source of deep and abiding terror. He knew all too well the fate of rulers who failed to keep their realms in line, who allowed the specter of rebellion to take root. The memory of his father's ignominious end, stripped of his throne and exiled to a distant province, loomed large in his mind. As the pressure mounted, Herod turned increasingly to drink, seeking solace in the numbing embrace of wine. His once sharp mind grew clouded, his judgment impaired by the fog of alcohol. Herodias, ever the consummate schemer, worked tirelessly to fill the void, tightening her grip on the reins of power even as her husband sank deeper into a mire of despair. And all the while, in the hills and valleys of Judea, a new force was gathering strength. The followers of Jesus, the enigmatic rabbi from Nazareth, had begun to make their presence felt, preaching a message of love and forgiveness that stood in stark contrast to the corrupt and oppressive rule of the Herodians. Herod and Herodias, consumed by their own struggles, paid little heed to the growing movement, dismissing it as yet another manifestation of the fanaticism that seemed to breed like flies in the Judean heat. But others, more attuned to the currents of history, sensed that something momentous was afoot, that the world was on the brink of a transformation that would echo through the ages. In the halls of Machaerus, a once great king and queen clung to the trappings of power, their grasp growing more desperate with each passing day. And beyond the palace walls, a wind was rising, a gathering storm that would soon sweep away the old order and usher in a new era of faith and reckoning. Chapter 10, The Price of Power, the End, when it came, arrived with a swiftness that stunned even the most seasoned observers of the Herodian court. The unraveling of Herod Antipas and Herodias' rule, long in the making, reached its tipping point in a series of events that cascaded with the inexorable force of a rockslide. It began with a miscalculation, a fatal overreach born of desperation and hubris. In a bid to shore up his flagging support, Herod made a grand gesture of allegiance to Rome, embarking on a journey to pay homage to the new emperor, Caligula. The young ruler, capricious and quick to take offense, was flattered by the attention, but he also saw an opportunity to assert his dominance over the client kings who orbited the imperial throne. In a calculated display of favor, Caligula granted Herod's rival, Agrippa, the title of king, along with dominion over the territories of Judea and Samaria. For Herod and Herodias, the news was a thunderbolt, a stunning reversal of fortune that left them reeling. In one fell swoop, they had been outmaneuvered, their power and prestige diminished in the eyes of Rome. Herodias, ever the fighter, refused to accept the humiliation lying down. With a fire born of wounded pride, she urged Herod to make his own play for a royal title, to petition Caligula for a crown to match Agrippa's. It was a gamble born of desperation, a last-ditch effort to cling to the trappings of power. But Agrippa, wily and ruthless, outplayed them once again. He dispatched emissaries to Rome, bearing tales of Herod's disloyalty and treachery. The accusations, embellished with artful lies, found ready ears in Caligula's court, already primed to view the tetrarch with suspicion. The emperor's wrath, once roused, was swift and terrible. Herod, summoned to answer the charges against him, found himself stripped of his title and his lands, condemned to exile in the distant reaches of Gaul. Herodias, faced with a choice between comfort and loyalty, chose to follow her husband into banishment, a final act of defiance in the face of an ignominious end. As word of their downfall spread, the people of Judea greeted the news with a mix of shock and grim satisfaction. For many, the humbling of the Herodians was seen as a long-overdue reckoning, a justice meted out by the hand of God. In the streets and marketplaces, the name of Jesus was spoken with increasing fervor. The teachings of the man John had proclaimed as the Messiah taking root in the hearts of a populace hungry for hope and meaning. For the followers of Jesus, the death of John was a sobering moment, a reminder of the costs of discipleship and the opposition they would face. They remembered the Baptist's unwavering conviction, his steadfast belief that Jesus was the Lamb of God, the one who would take away the sins of the world. In John's martyrdom, they saw a testament to the truth of his message, a confirmation of the divine nature of Jesus' mission. As the Herodian world crumbled and the old order passed away, the stage was set for a new era, a time when the kingdom Jesus had proclaimed would begin to take root in the hearts of the faithful. The Baptist had played his part, preparing the way for the one who would baptize with the Holy Spirit and with fire. Now, as the mantle passed from forerunner to Messiah, the story of redemption entered a new chapter, a chapter that would change the course of history and echo through the ages. In the years that followed, as the tides of history swept over the land, the tale of Herod and Herodias faded into legend, a cautionary saga of ambition and hubris. But the legacy of their rule, the scars left on the soul of a nation, would linger long after the last stone of Machaerus had crumbled to dust. For in the end, the story of Herodias was not simply that of one woman's rise and fall, but of the eternal struggle between power and principle, between the lure of earthly glory and the call of a higher truth. It was a reminder that even the mightiest may be brought low, and that the currents of history, once set in motion, have a force that no mortal can hope to resist. And so, as the sun set over the Judean hills, casting long shadows across the land, the tale of a queen and a prophet reached its end, a final note in a symphony of faith and folly, of passion and betrayal. And in the gathering darkness, the seeds of a new era took root, a time of reckoning and renewal that would reshape the world for generations to come.